Good afternoon. I've been asked to talk about the pressures on senior business people and what makes them go off the rails. I'm not just going to talk about hubris, some of these villains and monsters that we've heard about, but about rather more commonplace forms of failure, because there is a spectrum here. You won't, I'm afraid, get any medicine from me, not even the poetic insights of psychiatry. And I'm afraid it will be rather more social studies than rigorous Cambridge. But what I intend to do is to, thank you, blank screen, that sums me up. What I intend to do is to talk to you for about 25 minutes or so. I have some prepared remarks and I will riff spontaneously around them and then take questions. And if nothing else, I hope that the way I speak to you will encourage you to ask me penetrating questions, because that's going to be the best part of the day, I suspect. I'm afraid there may have been some advance publicity suggesting that I would principally speak about financial market executives, what are called by laymen bankers. That's not my intention, and those of you who are just here for that can go if you wish. They form a relatively small, though unforgettable, slice of my personal sample. Someone asked about risk appetite during the last talk. There's a place to be explored perhaps at the end about how some banking leaders, infected by the trading mentality, which has nothing to do with being a bank executive, develop a gambling streak. Very, very dangerous pathology. My observations are going to be drawn from my own experience, second-hand, that's to say people I've observed at one remove, first-hand people I've interacted with very closely, and what you might think of as zero-hand, my personal failings and fallibilities. Much of what I say will be a rehearsal of the blooming obvious, but it is party conference week, and that's often a successful approach in public life. The only thing I won't talk about and won't answer questions about is the recent meeting of the Bank of England's Financial Policy Committee, in respect of which I'm in the deepest purdah. I shall have to walk out if anyone even mentions it. Now, I'm going to talk about the chief executives of public companies. These people are objects of adulation, envy, and contempt, depending on minor details of audience segmentation. I've been a CEO, I've been two CEOs, in fact. I've worked for these people, I've worked alongside them, I've been their chairman, I've known very many. A lot of what I say will also apply to people outside the corporate sector, and indeed to people within it at levels below that of CEO. But it's the leaders I'm really talking about today. Their jobs are exceptionally demanding and I believe exceptionally interesting. I have no idea whether this audience would instinctively accept or question the second. Of course, some companies are more interesting than others and very much more important, which isn't the same thing. But it's the fact that the jobs are intellectually extraordinarily demanding and emotionally extraordinarily demanding, from which, in my view, the interest comes. Outsiders frequently imagine that senior business people spend their time studying data and deriving precise and desiccated decisions from it. In fact, just like public policymakers, they usually need to act on the basis of dirty or incomplete information. And they're weighing risks and probabilities and using intuition as much as they're using deduction. The more senior the job as a rule, the more uncertain the information on which you have to act. And you don't have the luxury, for competitive reasons, of waiting for certainty. So in theory, at any rate, we are demanding people of high ability. They need not just intelligence, but judgment, an ability to balance confidence and realism, daring and caution, and to maintain equilibrium even when they're executing what can be quite violent shifts in the life of a company. And it's, of course, the loss of that judgment that one worries about in a setting like this one. They need stamina and resilience. They need to be able to attract and inspire other people, while at the same time retaining the ability to make dispassionate assessments of the people they are inspiring. They need patience and they need impatience, and they need to know when each should be applied. It's very important to get that right. Today, of course, they need to be, and today more than ever, they need to be fluent communicators to all sorts of audiences, sophisticated and simple. And it is good if they have warm hearts and cool heads. Now, sometimes when you read a candidate profile prepared by a firm of headhunters, and I haven't been quoting from one just then, one has the feeling that the Archangel Gabriel would probably not make the long list. And it can be a bit of a shock to view the lineaments of the mere mortal who actually gets appointed. But I can tell you from long experience that while the major determinant of a firm's success is probably its underlying market position and related externalities, a good manager is much better than a bad one, and a very good one can make a huge difference. Hence the preparedness to pay a lot of money to get a very good one. Unfortunately, they are quite difficult to identify ex ante. Now, new CEOs come either from inside an organization or they enter it as an outsider taking the top job. I wanted to cover the logical waterfront in case there was anybody here from Trinity. But very broadly, and here I abandon pretensions to logic, the inside candidate tends to be a continuation of the former regime, the outsider a deliberate break with it. But any new CEO is bound to want to stamp his own mark on the company. This can be more difficult for the promoted insider, who's expected to be respectful, at least in public, of his predecessors' policies and achievements. In either case, from quite early on, the ego is very actively engaged. Now, Freud's insights are the object of much abusive vulgarization when it comes to the behavior of public men and women, and I don't wish to foster or promote this debased tradition. But it is inescapable that the biggest difficulty that a new CEO faces, although virtually none of them think about it this way, is to keep control of his own basic drives. Our complete control is pretty much unknown, and it was reassuring to have Christoph tell us that a small amount of intoxication is permissible. But most serious failure has its roots in loss of grip and the failures of judgment that inevitably follow. Now, there are obvious parallels between the corporate CEO and the politician in this regard, and in many others, and I've often watched political careers unfold with fraternal fascination. There are, of course, huge differences too. Countries are more important than companies. But a CEO, in general, but a CEO has much more freedom of action on his smaller canvas, the size and shape of which he may be able to change quite radically. David Cameron is not free to spin off Wales and reverse into Venezuela, even if he had support from the Liberal Democrats. We expect CEOs to be prepared to take far bigger risks with a company than we would comfortably permit in a politician. Our politicians long for power and are often frustrated when they achieve it to find how circumscribed it is. Business people have different motivations, of course, but they often long for what they call success, which is a kind of amorphous blend of power, money, and celebrity. I have seen more businessmen suffer from power going to their heads than politicians, and I want to discuss later on why that is the case. I always used to think that the desire for power as a broad generalization, led to more damaging behavior and more deadly consequences than the love of money. After the financial crisis, I'm not quite so sure. But I think when you're talking about stupendous amounts of personal money, exceeding the utility function, even generously described, by a couple of orders of magnitude, it's probably more about power than money anyway there. Another big and very important difference is that politicians are ruthlessly and ceaselessly lampooned, caricatured, and attacked. Indeed, an increase in the frequency of such attacks at some stages in their career may perversely be welcome to them, since it's usually a sign that they're getting somewhere. Not all of them deal with this especially well, but it does act as a kind of third-party control on things getting hopelessly out of hand. Now, chief executives, on the other hand, are rarely criticized inside their businesses. The fact of their office induces a slavish and soporific devotion. They occasionally get a bit of bad press, or have an investment analyst write something caustic. But compared with politicians, they appear to live a charmed life. And this is a real problem. I knew a boss of a FTSE 50 company in the 1990s, doing very well, who genuinely believed that the only balanced reporting about his business was to be found in the in-house magazine. Now, most of us just need to be slapped down from time to time to stop ourselves getting big-headed. And fine, a lot of criticism is unfair, ill-motivated, or just plain wrong. But oversensitiveness about it is a sure sign of danger. New CEOs generally find themselves famous in a modest way, probably for the first time in their lives. Some of them, I'm afraid to say, like this very much indeed. I once had a colleague who worried if his photograph did not appear in the Financial Times at least twice a week. That's actually quite a high bar, and for much of the time he reached it. And this again is not to be encouraged. A very shrewd investment manager once told me that he avoided investing in any company if his mother had heard of the chief executive. This lightning heuristic saved him, he told me, from a number of expensive catastrophes. Concerted praise from outsiders can also be a sell signal. Long, long ago, when I was a financial journalist, we analysed the first 12 or so winners of the Guardian's then Young Businessman of the Year award. 11 had got into serious trouble soon after winning, if I recall the study correctly. Now, this was almost entirely a cyclical issue. The winners had come to the judge's attention precisely because they were riding high on a wave that was about to break. Let us be charitable and suppose that hubris associated with winning the prize did not play any part in their downfall. Just a word on gender. My sample is necessarily weighted towards male CEOs. I've known a lot more of them, though I have second and third-hand experience of women in this role and very wide experience of female colleagues in senior management. Some of the failings I'm describing may seem to have a distinctively masculine timbre, and they do. But then many of the female pioneers in the most senior business roles had adopted, perhaps had felt obliged to adopt, rather masculine behavior patterns in their own careers. And it therefore follows that what I say will broadly apply to them too. This is a real shame because it reduces diversity of behavior. There are some tentative signs, and I'm sorry it's happening at the end of my career rather than in the middle, that as very senior women become less lonely in their positions, their collaborative instincts, which, if I may be allowed a crass generalization, seem to be rather better developed than they are in men, may be coming to the fore. If this is true, it is good news for the corporate ecology. I talked about the business cycle in respect to the prize. I'm now old enough to have seen 3 or 4 iterations of the businessman's progress from hero to dunce to crook. And then, surprisingly perhaps, but with an entirely different cast for the revival, back to hero again. The executive who believes that all that goes right with the company is a result of his stewardship, while all that goes wrong can be attributable to unforeseeable bad luck, amounting almost to acts of God, is a very familiar figure. It's an easy way of thinking to fall into, and it is exceptionally dangerous because those who don't recognize their errors are most unlikely to correct them. It's reinforced by having staff around who are unable or unwilling to criticize the CEO, and therefore constantly reinforce his self-deception, and in the end, his isolation. There's a breakdown, if you like, in the social protection systems, unlike the Bushman hunters. Now, sometimes, of course, quite often indeed, things do go wrong in the business environment that are not the CEO's fault, and one measures a good CEO on how he reacts to them. But often he will have done things to increase the organization's vulnerability to just the unforeseen adverse event which comes about. Too much exposure to a rapidly growing but volatile market, for example, or too much financial leverage. Especially in the run-up to the crisis, we saw a lot of financial leverage superimposed on operational leverage. So often one is managing risks and probabilities, both imperfectly understood. It has to be said that outsiders, in particular investors, in particular in a bull market, are quite likely to blame the CEO if he does not take what then turn out to be undue risks. And then if he takes them, blame him when things go wrong. But that comes with the job. It's what CEOs are paid for, if you like. The ins and outs of executive remuneration are not my subject today. But I would like to say that it is bad for people to be paid too much. Now, I don't mean bad for the company or bad for society. I mean bad for them. That's a safe remark in as much as everyone may have a different view of what constitutes too much, and it's more or less tautological to deplore excess. But what I mean is that when people are paid a lot of money for the first time, instead of thinking, goodness, how lucky I am to receive this windfall, quickly come to believe that they deserve it. Indeed, they rapidly convince themselves that they deserve more. And here I think we are among the chimpanzees. It's dangerous because it reduces both their sense of serving the greater good, and it increases their conviction that they are exceptionally brilliant and that the company is lucky to have them. And then it pushes them in the direction of what I regard as the corporate equivalent of the sin against the Holy Ghost, which is putting yourself before the organization. And I saw that appeared on David's list of 14 red lights. Of course, you can always find people. I mean, dissatisfaction can always be manufactured. You can find people in the city, you can certainly find people in the United States who are paid more, perhaps much more than you are. And this adds a layer of resentment to the millefeuille of vanity. I have great admiration for the successful executives, and yes, there are quite a number of them who are free of this deformity and can keep the rewards in perspective. That is a very, very positive marker when you find it. Who's going to tell the CEO that he's wrong? His closest colleagues, perhaps. The executive committee, or whatever it's called. In good companies, they do. They're encouraged to. And the CEO makes a point of running what one might think of as cabinet government, rather than through a series of bilaterals with colleagues who interact with each other only sparingly. This is easier said than done, because not only is the CEO clearly the boss, she will soon know, if she's any good, almost as much about every individual's colleague's area as they do, and very much more than anyone else on the group does. And this produces a fearsome asymmetry of information between the CEO and the rest of the team. I was reminded of this reading Charles Moore's Thatcher biography. Her early ministers complained that she worked too hard. What they meant was that she read their departmental briefs and that was sort of rather indecent, like the Germans practicing, the German footballers practicing penalties. You know, on top of the power relation which is there then, you know, and it tends to increase over time, the information imbalance makes genuine common decision-making very tricky. But the best CEOs know there's great advantage to be gained in reaching or being seen to reach joint decisions as often as possible. Where this can be done, the CEO is bound into the management team in a way that makes his unplanned departure for the vanity stratosphere rather less likely. The other source of critical input, of course, is the board of directors. On all boards, there exists a deep structural tension between the collaborative and the adversarial, which is extremely difficult to hold in balance. The directors are supposed at one and the same time to be supporting the strategic direction of the business, being the CEO's buddy, and acting as a policeman to make sure that nothing inappropriate is going on. Now, successive corporate scandals have tended to tip the formal balance increasingly towards the supervisory policing role. But it's a very uncomfortable pose for a body of men and women to hold for long, in what is, after all, a social context. And boards are social constructs, and embarrassment plays an important role, especially in high-context cultures. And while Britain isn't quite as high-context as Japan, it's up there. I saw in a book that I was reading in the train this morning, George Mikesh's beautiful remark, on the continent we either tell the truth or tell lies. The English hardly ever lie, but they wouldn't dream of telling you the truth. and this captures beautifully for me what is actually going on in these meetings. How many difficult questions may a director ask sequentially? How many may the chairman permit her to ask? Are you capable of holding friendly conversations with the CEO over dinner the night before and then laying into him in the morning? Or does this kind of behavior remind you of Richard III? I mean, my personal view is that while investors and governments hugely overestimate the role that boards can perform, the micro roles, the board's primary role should be defensive. It is to avoid gross error. Now, if I'm right, that may explain why successful boards never look particularly successful, while unsuccessful boards stick out a mile. Like the provision of sewage disposal services, or even in banking money transmission, it's a job that's only visible when it's done badly. Anyway, the point I want to make here, at the risk of shocking you badly, is that most CEOs don't think much of their boards. Deep down and not so deep down, they regard board meetings as a legal nuisance, a little like the AGM, although board meetings come around a hell of a sight more often. The CEOs, of course, may have, and usually do have, warm and admiring relations with individual board members, but the board as a whole, and this has got very much worse in the last 30 years, as business has grown more complex and general skills no longer get a non-executive director anything like as far as they used to. The board as a whole will always seem to know too little to provide much real help. It follows that the board's periodic attempts to question the CEO's ambitions or to slow things down are more likely to be resented than accepted with good grace. Boards sometimes behave in a manner that to executives seems positively obtuse. They're also capable, through some pared-down version of the wisdom of crowds, of being far greater than the sum of their individual parts. I've seen boards make a really bad case for turning a project down, for instance, and yet to be absolutely right to have turned it down. And when boards fall out with their CEOs, unless there's a clear strategic disagreement, the process usually feels incoherent, sub-rational, and deeply unsatisfactory. If the board members have the slightest self-awareness, they will recognize, painfully, how much their imperfect engagement has contributed to the crisis which they handle the only way they know how, which is decapitation. In short, I don't believe many boards do a good job of controlling their CEO or helping him control himself. Strong family relationships can be a powerful remedy against the development of unhealthy fantasy lives in the CEO. But wives or husbands or partners generally don't know enough about what's going on, really to imagine the side of things that they're not hearing, though they must sometimes pick up, if only from tone, that their loved one has got to a seriously strange place. Teenage children are the most effective puncturers of adult ego yet devised. But bringing them up is rarely a tea party, and therefore they cannot entirely be counted on to be what you might call a net contributor to stability. Then, if time allows, and increasingly it doesn't today, there are the lures of wine, women, and song, especially the second. However objectively unattractive a male CEO may be, enough women will be dazzled by his position to put him in temptation's way, to which the pressures of business may make him particularly vulnerable. This may bring him some validation, but on the whole is likely to increase the general level of stress, which was probably excessive in the first place. Just a word about time, in parenthesis. When I was CEO of Barclays in the mid-1990s, and this is deeply shocking to people today, I felt able to go away for 2 weeks in the summer and say to my colleagues, by all means call me if you want me, but only call me if you would have called me at home after midnight. Now, instant and continuous communication is not only possible, but it's compulsory. This has its good sides, but it does mean that CEOs never get away from the job, and it makes it easier for them, alas, to know about and therefore meddle in matters that should really not concern them. CEOs can, and often do, work very hard, go home exhausted, and be no use at all. If they are remembered, it's usually for doing one or two big things that only they were in a position to do. But identifying these requires thought, which we all know is hard, and executing them requires real determination. It's much easier to exhaust yourself with urgent trivia. CEOs need candid friends, but it's hard to find people who know enough about your situation to help without having some business relationship with you, which inevitably introduces some level of awkwardness, conflict, or constraint. I'm thinking of senior consultants or investment bankers who can be recipients of confidences under certain circumstances, and are at least capable, in theory, of giving honest advice, but they also want business. Far the best institutional answer we've found to this predicament, in the board system now practiced in the UK and in a number of continental countries, is the chairman-CEO split. The chairman is supposed to be the person in whom the CEO can, indeed must, confide, and who can watch out for and even counteract the multiple danger signs I've been discussing. When this relationship works well, it can be very positive. It can be very positive for the CEO and thus for the company. For much of the time, it operates under the seal of the confessional, and to pick up a point on Christoph's last slide, the explicit limitation in CEO power that is incarnated in the chairman seems to me to be of the highest importance. But even this goes wrong more than we like to pretend, though I am cautiously optimistic that we're getting better at it with practice. For it to work well, a number of fierce conditions have to be met. No cheating. The two people must respect each other in a way that goes beyond superficial politeness. The CEO must absolutely believe that the chairman does not want his job. Too many chairmen do want the CEO's jobs. They're frustrated ex-CEOs. The great structural problem when non-executive chairmen were first dreamt up was that most of them were former CEOs, good, bad, or indifferent. They came out of the CEO gene pool, all inclined to be alpha male, but all of a sudden they were expected to sit cross-legged and behave like a Zen master, which, frankly, very few of them resembled. The chairman's job is much less onerous than the CEO's, and in many ways less difficult, but its objectives are more subtle and more complex. You can go to the airport and buy many books that tell you how to be a successful CEO. They don't seem reliably to work, but I've never seen one that tells you how to be a chairman. Running the board is only a small part of the chairman's job. The governance gurus, of course, stress the board aspects of the role, but that's because they overestimate the overall importance of boards, probably never having sat on one. Make no mistake, boards are important, indeed indispensable, but in surprisingly limited ways. I had a conversation about 15 years ago with a senior US investor who said, we don't like this chairman-CEO split. We'd rather have one guy with complete control. We recognize that about 15% of them go completely haywire. But we think that in the 85% of cases, the concentration and speed of reaction that you get from having a single head outweighs and compensates for the failures. Now, if you're looking at this on a portfolio level, you can take this worldly view. If you're looking at it from a simple company's point of view, from a single company's point of view, it just won't wash. The general stresses in the CEO's job aren't much explored, apart from the obvious. A word from my own experience. In my late 20s, I wrote the Lex column on the Financial Times, which involved writing brief daily pieces about complex matters on which we presume to pass instant, infallible judgments. It was made much more difficult in those days by the fact that many companies did not announce news first thing in the morning, as they obligingly do today, before the market opens, but at any time it suited them, very often late in the afternoon and uncomfortably close to our deadlines. I know that journalists today claim that in the age of the internet, you have a deadline every second. I respect them greatly. Anyway, we had to write 6 columns a week, and every one was an adrenaline buster. I went from the FT to Courtaulds and found myself a year later responsible for a group of medium-sized businesses. The odd disaster aside, there was in those days nothing like the daily pressure of Fleet Street, let alone the level of personal exposure. But I noticed that within a matter of a few months, I was sleeping poorly. The business appeared to be the source of multiple strands of anxiety. And my role at the time was a very modest one, in no way comparable to being a public company CEO. What was going on? I tried to analyze my predicament, and I came to the following conclusion. At the FT, although the workday had been stressful, at the end of each day, the column was written. Sometimes it was a good one, sometimes not so good. But it was, as we said of the paper in those days of ancient print technology, it was put to bed. You went home, your work was over. It started again the next morning. But the business problems, in contrast, tended by their very nature to be slow, if not impossible, to resolve. After a little while, they simply accumulated. We're all familiar with those cartoons in which a prime minister is shown anxiously contemplating a whole list of intractable issues, some of which may be structurally rebarbative. The CEO of a large corporation is in just this position. He doesn't face, of course, the minute-by-minute popularity contest that the politician does, but he has more freedom of action in theory than they do, and sins of omission will weigh more heavily on him. Things pile up. And this pressure steps up very gradually. There's not a single moment that flips you. It is very tricky to deal with this. One is advised, and it's excellent advice, but unlike much good advice, easier to give than to take. One's advised to worry only about those matters that one can directly influence. Most successful CEOs do indeed concentrate on the fields in which they can make a difference, but the things you can't affect are still there to haunt you in the small hours. We were told earlier on to watch our dreams. On top of this inevitable source of strain comes the effect of expectations from the investor community. And here the CEO cannot win. The better she does, the more successful she is, the higher expectations rise for the next year. The ratchet is relentless, and eventual disappointment is more or less inevitable. In the end, the CEO is tempted to spend more time in the bunker with the people who really understand her. Now, just a couple of weeks ago, I saw some US business school research, it was from Wharton, I think, concluding with all the sterility of academic false precision that the ideal CEO tenure was 4.8 years. Because, and this is what resonated with me, in the first couple of years after appointment, the CEO balances internal and external inputs. Later, he increasingly relies on internal inputs alone. The researchers did not observe that he was probably doing this to keep hold on his sanity, but that may well have been the reason. Very often CEOs have to do unpleasant things. They have to close businesses, retrench, and in so doing, take away the livelihoods of large numbers of people. In the 1980s, when after a period of management abdication, very extensive surgery was and needed to be carried out on Britain's pre-war industrial base, it became commonplace to observe, and we heard Manfred this morning on this subject, that you didn't have to be a psychopath to be a CEO, but it probably helped. In investment banking, it's long been held to be indispensable. Certainly, the image of charm, plausibility, and ruthlessness bordering on sadism was widely held to be a characteristic of the people in these jobs. In the industrial field, I found it true of very few. But one did rather get used to dealing out what more sensitive souls might consider brutality, only in the way, very much in the way, that wartime leaders are required to steel themselves to some extent, but absolutely not all the way, against battlefield casualties. It was hard not to observe that it was very much easier to close a factory one had never visited. Arnold Weinstock was quoted as saying in the 1970s that he never visited any business units for fear of becoming emotionally involved. Sometimes apparent callousness goes hand in hand with self-knowledge. Personally, I found that gritting my teeth through years of this took quite a toll. And when I was very fresh to it all, I once failed to turn up in person at a factory that was being closed, an act of cowardice that I have still not forgiven myself for. One way or another then, as a former colleague of mine put it, after a few months alone in the job, the weight of the business will descend and settle on the CEO's shoulders. The confident, well-balanced person who was first appointed has to pick his way between the Scylla of arrogance and the Charybdis of oversensitive paralysis. In between, he'll learn a lot about his own limitations and his own humanity. Perhaps a new generation of female CEOs, untrammeled by the macho constraints of their predecessors, will find it easier to face these issues openly rather than denying them or pretending that they're trivial. Self-awareness is a great strength in a leader. The ability to cohabit with one's insecurities and that acceptance of one's own imperfections, which nowadays is called humility. It all matters, and it matters because leadership is getting harder, and as a society, we need good leaders more than ever. I've talked for longer than I meant to, I'm sorry. But we have got some time for questions if you have anything to throw back.